Captain Nathaniel Rhodes stood at the helm of the UEF flagship Endeavour, staring out at the vast, star-streaked expanse ahead. He gripped the armrest of his chair as the tension on the bridge mounted. This was it, the moment humanity had waited for. The first official contact with an alien species beyond the Sol system. His team was prepared, or so he hoped. Behind him, the quiet hum of the Endeavour's engines reverberated through the room. The crew moved with precise efficiency, though there was an underlying sense of anxiety that none of them could entirely hide. Rhodes wasn't immune to it. This wasn't a scientific mission. This was a diplomatic one, and the Sikra, their first target of contact, were not known for their diplomacy. The Sikra had conquered entire star systems, their culture built on survival at the most brutal cost. Their planet, Hexerath, was a death world, and their reputation had kept the galaxy's other species at arm's length for centuries. "Captain, we've arrived in Shikra space," reported Lieutenant Iris Velasquez, her voice steady but the flicker of worry in her eyes betraying her. Rhodes nodded and motioned for the comms officer to open the channel. The screen blinked to life, showing a dark, jagged alien warship approaching from the void, its size intimidating even from a distance. Its surface was a tangled mess of sharp protrusions and glowing, menacing lines of energy, reminiscent of an apex predator's claws. "Captain Rhodes, we acknowledge your arrival. Prepare to be boarded," a voice crackled through the speakers, deep and guttural. It was devoid of warmth, as if the speaker was barely interested in their presence. The bridge fell silent, but Rhodes maintained his calm. The plan was simple: greet the Sikra envoy, offer peace, and hope the fragile negotiations would hold. But as he looked out at the alien ship slowly drawing closer, a knot tightened in his stomach. There was no way to predict how the Sikra would respond. He glanced over at Dr. Emily Carter, standing by the communications console. She had been the primary architect of this mission, a linguist who had spent years studying the few fragments of Sikra language that had trickled into human archives. But even she couldn't be sure what would happen once face-to-face with a species that had no concept of mercy. "Let's hope they're in a talking mood," Rhodes muttered. Before anyone could respond, the doors to the bridge slammed open. A group of Sikra soldiers stepped in, towering over the humans by several feet. Their skin was a mottled green-black, scaled and rough, with beady, predatory eyes that scanned the crew with unnerving intensity. Rhodes felt his stomach churn. "Show them respect, but be ready for anything," he whispered to Carter. The Sikra were here, and there was no going back. The Sikra soldiers moved with a fluidity that made them seem more like predators than beings. Their presence dominated the room. The air grew thick with an unspoken tension, and Captain Rhodes found himself instinctively straightening in his seat, though he refused to show fear. These were creatures that had survived on a planet where every moment could mean death. Their eyes flicked over the humans on the bridge, assessing them as one might assess a particularly dangerous prey. Dr. Emily Carter stood at Rhodes' side, calm, almost eerily so. She had met with alien species before, peaceful ones, dangerous ones, and everything in between, but this was different. The Sikra were not here for pleasantries. They were here to evaluate, to assert their dominance. Carter had no illusions about that. The alien leader, a massive creature with dark scales that shimmered like obsidian, stepped forward. His eyes were two piercing golden orbs, like twin suns locked in a predator's gaze. He spoke in the guttural tones of the Sikra language, and though the universal translator began to decode it for the humans, the hostility in his voice was unmistakable. "Humans, your species is weak, yet you dare come to our home, uninvited," he growled. Rhodes clenched his jaw. "We come in peace, only to talk," he said firmly, meeting the creature's gaze without flinching. "We offer no harm, only the hope of cooperation." The Secra leader chuckled darkly. "Cooperation." His words were heavy with scorn. "What do you think we would gain from you? You are insects in the eyes of my people. We consume the weak, and you are weak." The silence that followed was thick, each word from the alien a reminder of humanity's fragile place in the galaxy. For a long moment, Rhodes wondered if this was the end of the mission before it even began. They had prepared for this, but there was no way to truly prepare for the overwhelming presence of a species like the Secra. That's when Dr. Carter stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "Perhaps," she said, drawing all eyes to her, "it's not about what we are now, but what we could become. A partnership built on respect for what we each bring to the table." She paused, letting her words sink in. "You may see us as weak, but humanity has proven time and again that we can endure. We adapt. We innovate. We are survivors." The room fell into a tense quiet as Carter's words lingered in the air. The Secra leader studied her, his golden eyes narrowing slightly. For the first time, something in his expression shifted, a flicker of curiosity. "Survivors," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Very well, human. We will see if your species is worthy of more than extinction." Rhodes held his breath as the Secra leader turned away, signaling the others to follow. Dr. Carter exchanged a look with him, her expression unreadable. The first step had been taken, but whether it would lead to peace or destruction was still to be seen. The journey to Xerath was nothing short of harrowing. As the Endeavour descended through the atmosphere, Captain Rhodes looked out at the planet's surface. The sky was a murky, toxic red, swirling with clouds of ash and smoke. Xerath wasn't just a death world. It was a place where life itself fought for every breath. The human shuttle rattled against the fierce winds as it navigated the tumultuous skies, struggling to hold its course. The air outside the ship was toxic, so thick that even through the reinforced windows, Rhodes could barely see beyond the shuttle's hull. "Captain, prepare for landing," Dr. Emily Carter's voice came through the comms, steady despite the atmosphere's violent turbulence. "I recommend we don't stay on the surface longer than necessary. The Secra may be hardy, but even they don't linger in their most dangerous environments." Rhodes nodded, watching the team's instruments flicker with signs of strain as they plunged further into the planet's chaotic weather system. A few moments later, the shuttle lurched violently as the thrusters engaged, forcing them to crash land on a plateau that seemed as barren as it was deadly. The crew piled out into the thick, humid air, immediately overwhelmed by the stench of sulfur and decay. Rhodes had seen his fair share of dangerous worlds, but Xerath felt different. There was a constant, buzzing hum beneath the surface, an unrelenting reminder that everything here was out to kill them. Standing next to him, Dr. Carter pulled a breath mask over her face. "The atmosphere's corrosive. We need to move fast," she said, glancing at the Secra soldiers who had escorted them down from the ship. They were already moving, scanning the horizon, alert for any signs of danger. Ruktar, the towering Secra warrior, turned to Rhodes. His massive form was cloaked in jagged, armoured plating, and his eyes glowed with an eerie yellow intensity. "Your frail bodies cannot last long here. Your air filters will fail you within hours. I suggest you adapt quickly, human." Rhodes didn't flinch. He had trained for this. His team had trained for this. They'd expected the Secra's arrogance and their disdain for human fragility. It was time to prove them wrong. "Lead the way," Rhodes said, locking eyes with Ruktar. "We'll follow your lead. But don't mistake that for weakness. The Sucra warrior sneered, turning away without a word. He moved forward into the twisted, alien landscape, leaving the humans to follow in his wake. The world around them was a constant barrage of threats, giant, spindly creatures that could crush a man in seconds, acidic rain that ate through the metal of their equipment, and predators lurking in every shadow. It wasn't just the planet that was dangerous. It was the constant tension between the humans and their Sucra guides. Trust was thin. They had no reason to believe the Sucra wouldn't abandon them to the planet's hostile elements. But there was no choice. They had to keep moving. Hours passed, the environment growing steadily more hostile. Then the unthinkable happened. A massive creature, 10 times the size of a human, appeared from the dense jungle. Its scaly body was covered in thick armor, and its eyes gleamed with hunger. It lunged at the group, its claws slashing through the air like a massive serrated blade. Instinctively, Rhodes grabbed his rifle and opened fire, but the creature barely flinched. It was too powerful, too well adapted to Exarath's dangers. Before Rhodes could make a second move, Ruktar's roar split the air. He leaped forward with the speed of a predator, drawing a massive blade from his back and striking at the creature's throat with a precision that could only come from years of surviving in this deadly environment. The creature screeched, collapsing to the ground in a spray of thick, black blood. Breathing hard, Rhodes watched as the Sucra warrior stood over the dead beast. His yellow eyes flicked toward the humans, his sneer gone, replaced by something like respect. You fight well, but you are not yet ready for this world. The team exchanged wary glances. They had survived their first true test on Kerath, but Ruktar was right. They were far from ready. They had earned a moment of respect, but surviving Serath would take far more than that. The next few days were a blur of grueling survival tests. Ruktar, though begrudgingly impressed by the humans' resilience, made it clear that their soft ways were no match for Exarath's true dangers. The terrain was unforgiving, riddled with quicksand bogs, predatory insects, and the ever-present threat of massive creatures that seemed to lurk around every corner. The humans, led by Captain Rhodes and Dr. Carter, did their best to keep up with the Sucra, though they were not accustomed to the brutal pace. Every evening, Rhodes would collapse into his cot, every muscle sore, his mind exhausted, but he knew they were learning. The Sucra, despite their dismissive attitude, were showing them things, ways to read the land, to detect danger before it came, and most importantly, to trust their instincts. One evening, while the group camped near a river, Dr. Carter and Ruktar sat by the fire, the crackling flames illuminating their faces. Rhodes, cleaning his rifle in the shadows, overheard their conversation. Though they spoke in the Sucra tongue, Dr. Carter's voice was steady, her tone respectful but unyielding. "You say your world is survival of the fittest," Dr. Carter said, "but I see something more in you, Ruktar. There's an intelligence in the way you move, the way you think. It's not just about brute strength." Ruktar's voice was low, almost amused. "You think we are simply animals. You do not understand Kerath. It teaches only one thing, strength. Everything else is a lie. Weakness is punished." Carter didn't flinch. "I've studied your culture. There's more to it than what you've been taught. You respect strength, yes. But you also respect those who innovate, who outsmart the dangers of your world. It's why you haven't wiped out the weaker species, like the Drashans. You see something in them, something you can learn from." Ruktar shifted, his yellow eyes narrowing. "What is it you want, human? Why do you persist in speaking of things that do not concern you?" Dr. Carter met his gaze unwaveringly. "I want to understand you, Ruktar, not just as an enemy, but as a potential ally. The galaxy is bigger than Exerath. You are not the only ones who can dominate the stars." There was a long silence, the fire crackling between them. Rhodes watched from the shadows, his heart pounding. This was it, the first real crack in the wall of distrust between the two species. Finally, Ruktar grunted, standing up to his full height. "You are bold, human. I respect that." Dr. Carter didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Respect is the first step to trust, isn't it? Ruktar's lips curled into a rare, sharp smile, showing his fangs. "Perhaps, but trust is earned. You will have to prove yourselves." As the firelight flickered, Rhodes couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, small as it was the turning point. They had taken their first step, however tentative, towards something greater than survival, understanding. It would take time, he knew that. But for the first time since landing on Xerath, Rhodes felt something other than fear. There was a glimmer of hope that they might make it through this together. The uneasy truce between the humans and the Sikra was still fragile, but the shared hardships on Xerath had begun to forge a tenuous bond. Yet just as things seemed to settle into a rhythm, a new, far more terrifying threat loomed in the shadows. It came without warning. A sudden, eerie disturbance in the galaxy's communications network. For days, the UVF's long-range scanners had picked up only a strange anomaly in deep space, something that defied explanation. No one thought much of it until entire colonies, isolated in uncharted sectors, went dark. Then it happened again. Entire fleets, once in orbit around prosperous trade hubs, simply vanished. "Sir, you need to see this." Lieutenant Velasquez's voice came through the intercom, urgent, high-pitched. Rhodes rushed to the command deck of the Endeavour just as the screens came alive with images of ghostly fleets appearing from the dark. They were massive, beyond anything the humans or the Sikra had ever seen. Their ships were sleek, dark, and deceptively beautiful, like shadows made solid. No markings, no insignia. They came from nowhere, and their ships seemed to phase in and out of space as if they were warping reality itself. "They're not responding to any form of communication, Captain," Velasquez continued. "We tried every frequency. No response." Rhodes grimaced, looking over at Dr. Carter. She was staring at the image of the Voidborn fleet, her face pale. "They've arrived," she muttered. "The Voidborn," Rhodes whispered, his gut churning. He'd heard the legends, but no one ever believed them. A race that had moved through the galaxy, consuming everything in their path. No mercy, no diplomacy. They didn't conquer. They assimilated, forcibly joining species into their ranks and wiping out any that resisted. "Are they human?" Dr. Carter asked, her voice barely audible, as if speaking the words would make them more real. "Not anymore," Rhodes replied grimly. "They were once an ancient race, but their technology is different. They'd been re-engineering themselves, becoming something beyond biology, something not quite alive." The name struck terror in every officer's heart. The Voidborn were the ultimate predators of the galaxy, a threat so terrifying that it united every known species in mutual fear. They didn't care about borders or treaties. They cared only about assimilation. Ruktar, standing nearby, seemed to take the news with surprising calm. He folded his massive arms across his chest, his yellow eyes flicking toward Rhodes. "If they are as powerful as you say, your alliance with us means nothing," he said coldly. "The Voidborn will crush you." Rhodes locked eyes with this Sikra warrior. "Maybe, but they don't know what we're capable of." The Sycra's expression softened, just a fraction. You think your weak species has the strength to fight them. We have something they don't, Rhodes replied, his voice hardening. We're adaptable. We don't give up. Ruktar studied him for a long moment, his glowing eyes narrowing. Maybe, he muttered. Maybe you'll surprise me again. As the Voidborn fleet advanced, darkening the very stars they passed, the uneasy alliance between humanity and the Sycra faced its greatest test yet. But Rhodes, Dr. Carter, and Ruktar understood one thing for certain. To survive this, they would have to trust each other, even if it meant confronting the deepest fears of their species. The war for the galaxy had begun. The Voidborn had wasted no time. Within weeks, their fleet had descended upon the outer rim, destroying entire systems and leaving nothing but burned-out husks behind. The UEF and Sycra had no choice but to act. Their alliance, fragile as it was, had no alternative but to unite against a common enemy or be destroyed separately. The first joint operation was a disaster. Human and Sycra forces were still working through the complexities of coordination. The Sycra warships were a terrifying sight, huge, heavily armed, and designed for all-out destruction. The UEF ships, by contrast, were more agile, focused on precision strikes. In theory, their combined strengths should have been enough, but in practice, things fell apart quickly. Rhodes watched in horror as one of the UEF corvettes, the Cerberus, was obliterated in a sudden wave of Voidborn fire. It had tried to make a flanking maneuver against the Voidborn's enormous flagship, only to be met with a barrage of energy blasts that tore the ship apart in seconds. Casualty report, Lieutenant. Rhodes barked, his voice sharp. All crew lost, Captain. Velasquez responded, her voice tight. We're outgunned. If we don't regroup, we'll be wiped out before we even get a chance to retaliate. The void around them shimmered as the Voidborn fleet adjusted its position. Their ships moved with an eerie fluidity, their black hulls almost indistinguishable against the backdrop of space. Rhodes cursed under his breath. They're toying with us, he muttered. We need to strike back, or this is over before it even starts. Dr. Carter approached him from behind, her voice unusually calm. Captain, we've been fighting a war with the wrong tactics. We need to adapt, just like we did on Therath. Rhodes turned to her, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? They'd outmatched us on every front. Carter's eyes flicked over to the Sycra warships, still locked in combat with the Voidborn, their brute force trading blows with the enemy's relentless, calculated strikes. The Voidborn are predictable. They don't change tactics. They assimilate, adapt only by taking over their enemy's technology. We can outthink them. I believe our best chance is to disrupt their coordination. Rhodes felt a flicker of hope. How? We need to find their command center and destroy it. Carter said firmly, if we can cripple their command, the rest of the fleet will be thrown into disarray. Without the centralized control, they'll falter. Rhodes nodded, feeling the weight of the decision. A commando strike on their flagship. We'll have to get up close enough to plant a destabilizing charge in their core systems. It's a suicide mission. Ruktar, who had been silent until now, spoke with a growl. Then you should be prepared for it. Skra do not run from death. Rhodes met the alien warrior's gaze, nodding slowly. Then we fight together. The tension on the bridge was palpable, as they all realized what was at stake. The war had begun in earnest, and there was no going back. It was do or die. The plan was simple, almost too simple. Infiltrate the Voidborn flagship, destroy their command center, and cripple their fleet's coordination. Easy on paper. terrifying in practice. Captain Rhodes paced the command deck of the Endeavour, watching as the crew prepared for the most dangerous mission humanity had ever undertaken. The Void-born flagship loomed in the distance, dark, menacing, and impossibly large. The human fleet, aided by the Secra, was positioning itself in the shadows of nearby asteroids, hoping to get within striking range undetected. The odds of success were slim, but failure wasn't an option. The Void-born had already slaughtered too many to be ignored. "Captain," Dr. Carter's voice cut through the tension. She was standing by the comms station, her fingers flying over the control panel as she scanned the Void-born vessel. "We've pinpointed their command hub. It's located on the lower levels, deep within the ship's core. The defenses are dense, but I believe we can bypass them if we time it right." "Then we're running on a clock," Rhodes said, his voice grim. "Once we're in, we've got 15 minutes to plant the destabilizing charges before the Void-born realize what we're up to." Ruktar, standing at the far side of the room, his massive form shadowed by the ship's lights, stepped forward. "Secra do not fear death, but even we know this is a fool's errand. You will need more than your weapons to survive this." Rhodes met the Secra warrior's intense gaze. "We've got one shot at this, Ruktar. If we fail, we all die. But if we succeed, we may just have a chance to stop them." The Secra warrior's yellow eyes glinted with something that might have been respect. "Then we will die fighting." Carter looked between them. "If we can disrupt their communication systems and isolate the flagship from the rest of the fleet, we might cause enough confusion to scatter them. But we need to move fast. The Void-born are not idiots. They'll realize something is wrong long before our time is up." Rhodes nodded, slapping his comm badge to address his team. "All right, everyone, this is it. We go in, we plant the charges, and we get out. No heroics, no second chances. We're on a timer." The team, a mix of UEF and Secra soldiers, assembled in the shuttle bay. The air was thick with tension as they suited up, preparing for the mission ahead. The Secra, who had been cautious allies at best, now stood shoulder to shoulder with the humans, their faces hard with determination. "Stay close," Rhodes instructed. "We move fast. We stick to the plan. Get in, get out." The shuttle door slid shut with a hiss, and the small group launched into space, darting toward the looming Void-born flagship. Inside the vessel, the silence was almost suffocating. Every movement felt like a violation of the ominous stillness. The Void-born were everywhere, quiet, watching, waiting. As the shuttle neared the flagship's docking bay, the countdown began. The tension was unbearable. Rhodes, heart hammering in his chest, prepared for what came next, the plunge into the heart of the Void-born's dark empire. The shuttle's hull shuddered as it locked into place against the Void-born flagship's docking bay. Captain Rhodes didn't flinch. His mind was laser-focused, each heartbeat steady despite the overwhelming odds. The team had trained for this, prepared for the worst, and now there was no turning back. 30 seconds. Dr. Carter's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. She had the map of the flagship's internal systems, and she knew what was coming. "We need to get to the central core, disable the secondary security nodes, and plant the charges. Timing is critical." Rhodes nodded, his hand gripping the rifle slung across his chest. He scanned the team. Lieutenant Velasquez, who had been by his side through countless battles. Ruktar, the Secra warrior who, despite his arrogance, was now their ally in this desperate hour, and Dr. Carter, the brilliant linguist and tactician whose calmness had been a steadying force through the chaos. The shuttle door slid open with a hiss, revealing the eerie, dimly lit interior of the Void-born ship. The walls seemed to pulse with unnatural energy, the metallic surfaces shimmering with dark power. Rhodes could feel the weight of the ship's presence, as though it were a living thing, its very structure designed to intimidate. "Move," Rhodes ordered, and the team filed out in a tight formation, weapons raised and eyes scanning the shadows. They moved swiftly through the corridors, relying on Carter's navigation and the map she'd memorized from their scans. Every step felt like they were being hunted, and Rhodes couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The Voidborn had been expecting them. As they rounded a corner, the first wave of Voidborn soldiers appeared, humanoid, but their bodies were fused with their own technology, their eyes glowing with an unsettling, unnatural light. They were faster than any normal soldiers, their movements almost fluid, as if they were extensions of the ship itself. Rhodes fired first, his shots tearing through the air, but it wasn't enough. The Voidborn were relentless. "Fall back," Rhodes yelled. "We need to plant the charges now." They pushed forward, cutting down Voidborn as they went, but the enemy was everywhere. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing behind them as more Voidborn reinforcements closed in. Time was slipping away. Finally, they reached the central core, an enormous chamber filled with swirling alien technology. The control panels were alive with energy, and at the center stood the heart of the Voidborn ship, a glowing core that pulsed with dark power. "Plant the charges," Rhodes shouted. "Now." Velasquez moved quickly, setting the explosives, but before they could finish, a Voidborn commander, larger and more intimidating than the others, stepped into the chamber. His voice was a chilling blend of mechanical and organic, reverberating through the room. "Foolish humans, you cannot stop us," he sneered, his hands raising, and the chamber around them flickered, destabilizing. The countdown timer on the charge began. Rhodes's voice was cold and resolute. "We're not here to stop you. We're here to survive." With a final glance at the crew, he hit the activation button. The explosion rocked the flagship. The Voidborn commander's final screech was drowned out by the deafening blast. The core detonated, sending shockwaves through the entire ship. As the team scrambled to escape, the ship began to destabilize. The Voidborn had underestimated them. Humanity's adaptability, combined with Sikra tenacity, had given them the edge. The shuttle's engines roared to life, and the team made their way back to the Endeavour, the flagship's explosion visible in the distance as it collapsed into itself. The Voidborn's fleet was thrown into disarray. Without their command structure, they faltered, losing coordination. The war wasn't over, but the balance had shifted. As the team returned to the safety of their ships, Rhodes took a long breath, feeling the weight of the moment. They had survived the impossible, together. But this was only the beginning. And humanity, it seemed, had earned its place among the stars.